Hi, welcome to Exercise 9, the Respiratory System. It does start on page 87. Be sure to click the next slide so we can go on. Exercise 9 does start on page 87, and there are some instructional objectives and an introduction. You'll want to read through those, but we're really going to get started on figure 9.1. You will need to be able to identify structures on figure 9.1 and be able to give a function for them. We'll get to figure 9.3b. Don't forget from last week that arteries are going to go away from the heart. All of the arteries go away from the heart. Most of them are red because they're carrying oxygenated blood, but remember the pulmonary arteries were the exception to that. They were the blue ones. The veins always go towards the heart. Every last one of them goes towards the heart. Most of them are blue because they're carrying deoxygenated blood, but again, the pulmonary veins that we see again this week will be an exception to that. Figure 9.1 does have the structures that we do need to know for lab practicals. First of all, there is the pharynx. The pharynx is the throat, and for our purposes, that's usually where we leave things, although anatomy does break the throat or the pharynx into three different parts. There's the part of the throat that's behind the nose, the nasal pharynx. There's the part of the throat that's behind the mouth, the oral pharynx, and then there's the part of the pharynx that's behind the voice box, or the laryngopharynx. Okay, the laryngopharynx isn't on figure 9.1, but I thought I'd mention it anyway. The pharynx, or the throat, does have several sections. The first of which is the nasal pharynx. We do need to know about that one. It's the nose portion of the throat. Now, there is a big section of nose that I don't know why the lab book didn't really point out, but when you get to the back of the nose, you do start the area of the throat. That would be the nasal pharynx. The lab book also mentions the tongue. The tongue is in the mouth. I think most people knew that since about age 2 or so. The tongue does have taste buds, which really doesn't do very much for the respiratory system, but what the heck, it was a cheap and easy thing to label for lab practicals and stuff like that. Although I think we'll see it again in the digestive system. The oral pharynx is the mouth section of the throat. That's what most people would think of as throat. Don't stick your finger back down your throat so far that you barf or anything, but that would be in the oral pharynx, the mouth section of the throat. We really won't talk about the laryngopharynx, but that would be kind of in the neck around the larynx. There is going to be a larynx, and the biggest structure on there, the most important structure, is probably the epiglottis. It's the cartilage that covers the larynx, and it keeps food out of the trachea. We talked about that in lecture. When you swallow food, that epiglottis will close down over the trachea so that food ideally slides down the right pipe, which would be the esophagus for food. The esophagus is on the figure 9.1. It does exist on the model, but let's face it, we're doing the digestive system next week. We'll look at the esophagus next week in lab. So, cross that off of figure 9.1. We'll learn about it in exercise 10. The next structure is the larynx, or the voice box. On the figure that we've got, on figure 9.1, there's only one larynx. On the picture that I've got on the PowerPoint, there is the respiratory system on kind of the left side of the picture, and then on the right side of the picture, they've pulled out the conduction system and a lot of the parts that have cartilage. So the voice box is actually on both sides of the model. It's honestly a little easier to see on the right-hand side of the picture there, and it would be the voice box at the top. It does have the vocal cords, which if you push on it will kind of change your voice. Don't push on it. That's probably not good for you, although, yes, I illustrate it all the time. But there are the vocal cords that are in the voice box, and if you do push on it, yes, you can affect your speech patterns there. The next structure is the windpipe. The trachea. The trachea is also called the windpipe. It also exists on both sides of the picture, on the kind of human side and on the kind of plumbing side there. The windpipe does refer to the fact that you are breathing air in and out. Wind, not the stinky farty wind, but the breathing wind. So trachea would be the windpipe there. Figure 9.1 does have the right lung labeled. The right lung is on the right side of the patient, not the right side of the page. The left lung has been removed on the picture so that you can see deeper structures. The lungs in general are where oxygen and carbon dioxide is being exchanged. But honestly, I wasn't really going to ask you if that's a right or a left lung. It's a lung. We'll go on with life. Once you go further down from the trachea, you do hit bronchi. Bronchi are going to be tubes leading to each lung. Figure 9.1 in the lab book just points to one particular tube. One tube, singular, would be a bronchus. Several tubes, plural, would be bronchi. Really, on the picture, there's a whole bunch of different tubes, so I stand by my bronchi. On the other hand, the lab book is just pointing to one of the tubes, so I guess they stand by their bronchus. One bronchus, two bronchi. Usually I like the plural stuff, so on a lab practical, I'd probably call it bronchi. On figure 9.1, there is a heart, which pumps blood. Yeah, we did that one last week in exercise 8 with the cardiovascular system. Let me assure you, if I'm going to ask questions about the heart, I'm going to ask questions from last week's lab exercise. So I hate to tell you to cross it off, but you know how we've been saying that some of these things will look better later? Well, the heart looks better, only we have already covered it, so welcome to later? No, I guess we've already done later. Fine, whichever. Another structure that's on there is the diaphragm. The diaphragm, last semester in 1408, we generally say that it's a dividing line between the chest cavity and the abdominal cavity, and it is, but for the respiratory system, it's a muscle used in breathing. We'll see later that contracting the diaphragm causes you to inhale, and relaxing the diaphragm causes you to exhale. Contracting will have the diaphragm riding lower down closer to the abdominal pelvic cavity, and that'll create a lot of space in the thoracic cavity and the chest cavity, so air will just come in. Relaxing the diaphragm has the diaphragm riding really far up. There's less space in the thoracic cavity, so air goes out because there's not as much space in there. That leaves a few other structures on figure 9.1, one of which is the respiratory centers in the brainstem. Go ahead and omit that one. There really are places in the brain that do control your respiratory rate, but we consider those to be more nervous tissue and brain chapter stuff. Similarly, the thyroid gland is in the endocrine system and secretes some metabolic hormones, but, well, we're not looking at that for the respiratory system. Now, the esophagus and the heart, I hesitate to tell you not to study those because we will see them in other lab exercises, but they're not really in the respiratory system either. Figure 9.2 on page 90 is kind of neat because it does show the back side of the respiratory system, but really a lot of what it shows we've talked about in other places, either figure 9.1 or the Hearts and Parts chapter, exercise 8. So we're skipping over to figure 9.3. Figure 9.3 does have 4 sections. Figure 9.3a is what we just looked at. Figure 9.3b is what we're going to need to know. Ultimately, the little bronchi have been blown up so that you can see some of the microscopic structures, like a terminal bronchioli. That would be the last microscopic branch before the alveoli attach. It's the last little itty-bitty teeny-tiny tube before other structures attach. Those other structures would be the alveoli. Those would be the microscopic structures where the oxygen and carbon dioxide takes place. Each of the little grape-like structures is 1 alveolus or 2 alveoli. Yes, the lab book points to 1 and calls it an alveolus, and they are correct. They're pointing to 1. It is singular. However, there are a bunch of the things. There's probably 25 of them on the picture alone, and so I use the plural term of alveoli. Same difference. There are some blood vessels on figure 9.3b. The pulmonary artery does go away from the heart like all the other arteries, but it's going away from the right side of the heart to the lungs to pick up oxygen. Remember the question from exercise 8, what type of blood does the pulmonary artery carry? Deoxygenated blood. It is blue because there's very little oxygen in the blood, but it's still an artery because it goes away from the heart. Similarly, there's the pulmonary vein, which does carry oxygenated blood to the heart from the lungs. Anything that's going to the heart would have a vein type of name. This one is special because it is in red. It has just been to the lungs. It has just picked up the oxygen. But it is still a vein because it is still going back to the heart. Unfortunately, figure 9.3b does come actually from an anatomy book. Can you tell? It's got a few extra structures that us non-science majors don't really need to know about. There really is some smooth muscle around many of the fibers in the alveoli, and that does allow them to contract, which helps force air out of the lungs. The elastic fibers would let the alveoli bounce back so that they open back up breath after breath. That's probably good and important for inhaling, but they're not really shown on my model. There is also a respiratory bronchioli. I never have exactly figured out what makes it a little different from the terminal bronchioli, so we're just going with the terminal bronchioli, which is more in my picture anyway. I suspect in anatomy class, the terminal bronchioli has more cartilage on it like the trachea and the bronchi do, and the respiratory bronchioli probably has more of the smooth muscle and elastic fibers like the alveoli do, but that's a bit much for anatomy students, let alone non-science majors. There are capillaries. Really, when that pulmonary artery in blue comes to the alveoli to pick up the oxygen, that does happen in the capillaries. And on my picture here, you can almost make out where there might be some blue mixing with some red. That would be kind of a purple capillary. It's almost impossible to show that on a lab practical, so we're crossing off the capillaries as well. The alveolar sac is where you've got a whole bunch of alveoli working together to be part of the lungs. That's nice, more than non-science majors need to know, just omit those structures. Also, figure 9.3c is kind of a blow-up picture there, and is not on my model. Figure 9.3d is a blow-up of C as well, and if C wasn't on there, D's not on there, so never mind. On page 92, at the top, they do start talking about the mechanics of breathing, and the part number 1 talks about inhalation and exhalation. The lab book's going to go into a little bit of detail, although, to be fair, they have dropped a lot of the detail out from previous editions. But honestly, as the diaphragm contracts, it is pulled more downward, so that there's more room in the lungs and air comes in. We call that inhalation. As the diaphragm relaxes, it rides up, so there's less room in the rib cage and the lungs, and air goes out. Exhalation. I like the pictures in the PowerPoint a little better than the pictures in the lab book. It's kind of hard to see what's happening in the lab book on figure 9.4, but on the guy on the figure A on the left-hand side of the page, the diaphragm is going down and the ribs are expanding and widening. That does create more space in the thoracic cavity and air goes in. Anatomy students get subjected to Boyle's law and partial pressures and all sorts of weird stuff, but it's been my experience that non-science majors are okay with there's more space in the chest cavity, so air goes in. On the left side, the diaphragm is relaxed, Now, when muscles relax, they are actually longer. When the diaphragm is longer, it rides up further into the thoracic cavity, and that forces air out for an exhalation. Again, anatomy students get subjected to partial pressures and things like that, but usually non-science majors are okay with there's less space and the diaphragm is going to push the air out. What many people get confused with is it's actually the diaphragm relaxing. Usually if you're talking about pushing the air out, that sounds active and most people guess it's a contracted diaphragm. But really, when the muscle is contracted, it's shorter, and the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. That does make the diaphragm further down in the thoracic cavity. When it relaxes, it expands out, lengthens, and it does lengthen upward. That does force the air out, which is backwards from what a lot of people would have guessed. But diaphragm contracts, inhale, diaphragm relaxes, exhale. Also on page 92, part number 2, bell jar balloon apparatus. The lab book thinks we should examine a respiratory model consisting of a glass bell jar fitted with a rubber stopper and a glass Y tubing, 2 balloons, and a rubber sheet. You probably could make this at home if you had to, but we'll be watching a couple of videos shortly. There is well, honestly, in our lab, we've got a plastic bell jar that's been fitted with, oh my god, it really is a rubber stopper. The glass Y tubing, part of the Y, the stem of the Y, goes through the rubber stopper, and then there's 2 other little parts, the tails on the Y, do attach to the little balloons. The Y in question is actually upside down. That may make it a little hard to find on the figure, but there is some, well, honestly, it's plastic Y tubing. We do have 2 balloons, and then the bottom does have some rubber sheeting that has been firmly attached there, and unfortunately breaks really easily. What we're supposed to do is pull down on the rubber sheeting, and let's see what happens. Unfortunately, since this one's going to be hard to make at home, and, well, we're going to use it for about 5 minutes, there's a couple of videos on the next page. There are a couple of videos that you should watch. The first one, you really only need to watch the first 30 seconds or so. They'll do what we need to show in the first 30 seconds, and yeah, it continues on after that. The second video does have a little more explanation if you'd like to find out what's going on. But really, we should pull down on the rubber sheeting. That creates a little more space in the bell jar. That lets air go into the lungs. When you push up on the rubber sheeting, that has a little less space in the thoracic cavity, and air goes out of the lungs. Just like it would if you were playing with a real diaphragm. On page 93 of the lab book, they do start asking some questions. We've pulled down on the rubber sheeting, and the lungs inflate. How does this compare to muscle action in the human body? What muscle movements bring about a similar action in the body? That would be the diaphragm contracting. The rubber sheeting is supposed to be the diaphragm. For that matter, letter C is going to ask us to compare the bell jar model with the human system by naming the human counterpart that goes with the model part. It's a kind of unnumbered table in the lab book. The glass tubing kind of depends, what it's supposed to be, kind of depends on which part of the glass tubing you're looking at. The stem of the Y that's going through the rubber stopper is really supposed to be the single trachea. However, the little splits where it's arms and facing downward and attached to the balloons, that would be part of the bronchi. So humor your instructor, and for glass tubing, do put trachea and bronchi. Where they've inconveniently got a question mark in the table, just kind of right over that. The balloons are supposed to be the lungs. You probably guessed that already from talking about them inflating and deflating. The rubber sheeting we've already mentioned should be the diaphragm. Yeah, when it contracts, the lungs expand. When it relaxes and rides up, the lungs exhale. The walls of the bell jar are pretty much the wall of the chest. The picture I've got showing here says thoracic walls, walls of the chest, rib cage, that sort of thing. We're all talking about the same thing. Humor your instructor, write wall of the chest. The picture here is trying to label the space on the inside of the bell jar, and in anatomy class they do call that a pleural space, but we're not worried about that. On page 93, part number 3 refers to the vital capacity measurement, and in our labs on campus we use an instrument called a spirometer that measures vital capacity. The lab book defines this as the amount of air forcibly exhaled from the lungs after a forcible inhalation. What you do is you take a really deep breath in, you use one of the little spirometers there, and you take a really deep breath out. You blow as hard as you can, and you check what's known as your vital capacity. There are a couple of videos there. One of them does a little better job of explaining what's going on in the lungs and the vital capacity, and talks about asthma and cancer rather than emphysema, but the explanation actually works for emphysema as well. The second video kind of shows the vital capacity spirometer in action, although they are using a much fancier version of what we've got. Our little thing is just kind of pictured here. You do put a disposable mouthpiece on it. It is currently set to 0, so you take a really deep inhale, hold your nose, put the spirometer in your mouth, and blow as hard as you can. Generally, you are probably going to blow for 6 to 10 seconds there and blow as much air as you can. The little needle will actually turn, and that should give you a vital capacity there. So do watch the videos and then go on to the next slide. Unfortunately, I really don't know any way for you to check your vital capacity. I suppose we could do some funky experiment where you blow up a balloon and release it into water and see how much water is displaced. Yeah, that sounds like a lot of work too. Honestly, what you do, you still need to know how to calculate the percent of normal vital capacity. On a lab quiz or a lecture exam, the formula will not be provided, so you will need to know that formula. It's simply the actual vital capacity divided by the predicted vital capacity times 100. My numbers generally run about 3,700 on the little gizmo. That would be my actual number. My predicted number for my height and my age, not telling that one, but the number would be 2,900. So my percentage of normal vital capacity would be 3,700 divided by 2,900 times 100 would equal 128%, woohoo, after rounding a little bit. Should you be concerned if your vital capacity is more than normal? Mine's 128%, normal would be 100%, and no, I'm honestly not real worried. Generally, if you do have higher than normal vital capacity, you're probably doing pretty good on your lung capacity. Woohoo, that's great. Should you be concerned if your vital capacity is less than normal? Maybe. Kind of depends on exactly how much less than normal. Every semester I get students who are at 99%. Oh my God, Miss Snaples, I'm panicking. I'm not at 100%. Don't panic. 99, try again a couple more times, get some practice, hold your nose, and you'll probably make that 100%. Now, if you're about 75% of normal, that might be a little more worrisome, although there might be other factors. If you know you have other problems, asthma, emphysema, smoking, fat and overweight and out of shape, yeah, that might explain things. If you do have a vital capacity low enough, say about 50%, you probably already know that you have a problem. I've had several students in class who know they've got asthma, emphysema, bronchitis, sick, something's going on, and sometimes they do have their own handheld spirometers that they keep at home to make sure that their breathing treatments are actually working for them. If you were at 75%, I'd tell you to check with your doctor next time you go in. You might mention it. If you're at 50% and you didn't know that before, I might make the doctor's appointment and go ahead and tell him you're worried about your lung capacity. The lab book also asks, how would emphysema affect vital capacity? Well, it might be nice to actually know what emphysema is. Emphysema is when the alveoli deteriorate. One of the videos talked about the alveoli deteriorating with cancer, and emphysema would cause the same problem. You wouldn't have as much lung capacity, so emphysema would affect vital capacity by lowering the vital capacity. Because you've got less lung parts on the inside, yeah, you're not going to breathe out as much air. With asthma, the trachea contracts. The trachea should be wide open and you should be able to move a lot of air in and out of the lungs. With asthma, the trachea contracts and there's not as much space to get the air in and out of the lungs. You probably have okay lung capacity, you just can't prove it. The trachea is so constricted you can't hardly breathe, and if it takes you twice as long to force all the air out, well, you might even be trying to take a breath before you can force all of your air out, so it becomes a bit of a problem in proving how much vital capacity you really have. Humor your instructor, asthma lowers the vital capacity, as does emphysema. Exercise and practicing and stretching your lungs would all raise vital capacity eventually, but no, the lab book didn't ask about that. At the bottom of page 93, the lab book starts into the physiology of respiration and how you actually breathe. First of all, they start talking about the regulation of respiratory movements. Now, they do get into a bit of detail. But honestly, if you were going to hold your breath for any length of time, you hold your breath, levels of oxygen are decreasing. Hopefully you remember from lecture that levels of carbon dioxide are actually rising. Now, most people would guess that it's the low oxygen level that makes you take the breath, but hopefully you remember from lecture that high levels of carbon dioxide are what actually makes you take a breath. Yes, there are a whole bunch of other technical details, and the lab book tries to explain some of them, but concentrate on the high levels of carbon dioxide make you take a breath. The rest of them contribute, but high levels of CO2 make you take a breath. On page 94, part number 2, Variations in Respiratory Rate, they tell you to have a lab partner count for you and get the number of times you breathe per minute. Wait a minute, I don't really need somebody to count for me and see how many times I breathe. Honestly, we don't even have a lab partner when we are doing these in the on-campus labs. I mean, really, in this day and age, we don't need anybody staring at your chest. We kind of call that sexual harassment nowadays. So keep track of your own breathing rate. When you do keep track of your breathing rate, be sure to count either the inhales or the exhales, but not both. You'll need a clock with a second hand or a watch or your cell phone if you can get it to do the seconds there. Do keep track of your breathing rate for 1 minute. While sitting still, just see how many times you breathe in or how many times you breathe out. Do be sure to do some nice normal breathing. One of the problems we do have with this experiment is people will start, oh, I gotta hold my breath. No, I gotta pant. No. Really, the hardest part is trying to breathe normal. So breathe normal, keep track of your breathing rate while sitting still. Do record that on page 94. They'd like you to check your breathing rate after 2 minutes worth of exercise. There's a spot to record that on page 94. They'll tell you to breathe deeply and vigorously with an open mouth for 1.5 to 2 minutes. Don't do that. You'll hyperventilate. You might even pass out. But try about 30 seconds of deep breathing and then see what your breathing rate is. When you check your breathing rate, most people while sitting still will have somewhere in the 12 to 20 range of breaths per minute. Generally, if you're on the 12 or less side of things, you're probably doing pretty well. You probably had some good lung capacity from the good vital capacity on the previous experiment. On the hearts and parts experiment, you probably had closer to the 60 beats per minute there. You're probably doing pretty good. On the other hand, if you're on the 20 side of things for the breathing rate, then you might not have as good a lung capacity. I would guess your heart rate would probably be a little on the higher side from exercise 8 as well. Although, no promises, my heart rate tends to run fairly high, but my lungs and vital capacity tend to be really good. So I guess I gotta worry about high blood pressure and heart disease more than lung problems. Yeah, well, sometimes the numbers will tell you things. After 2 minutes worth of exercise, most people can add 2 to 5 breaths per minute to their normal total. What happens, they do ask us to explain the basis for the change in the respiratory rate. What happens is while you're exercising, your body puts out more carbon dioxide, and higher levels of carbon dioxide make you take more breaths. Something about high carbon dioxide equals more breathing. When you did breathe deeply and vigorously, even if it was only for 30 seconds, most people will have a slightly lower breathing rate. You might not experience that, but most people will have either 1 to 3 breaths less per minute. If you are on the 12 side of things, you probably aren't going to drop too much, but if you are on the 20 side of things, you might drop a little more. Generally, what happens when you do the deep breathing is you get rid of a lot more carbon dioxide. So low levels of carbon dioxide generally indicate less breathing, and you'd be taking less breaths per minute. Next on page 94 is part number 3, voluntary control of breathing. They want to know how long you can hold your breath after a normal inspiration. Again, you'll have to use that clock with the second hand, watch, or the cell phone, whichever. At least you've probably still got it out. What you do is you take a normal inhale. Don't inhale really big, just exhale normal, inhale normal, hold your breath. See how long you can hold your breath after a normal inhale. Ideally, then run in place for another 2 minutes and see how long you can hold your breath. Then try the 30 seconds of deep breathing again and see how long you can hold your breath then. Which one lets you hold your breath the longest? Results do kind of vary for the voluntary control of breathing. How long can you hold your breath? I've taught this one for many years in labs, and it's kind of hard to tell sometimes because I can't always see when most people are really starting to take a breath again. But generally, most students will take a breath at about 45 seconds to a minute. Your inhales, breathing may vary, but 45 seconds to a minute is probably around average. After running in place for 2 minutes, generally most people will cut 15 to 25 seconds off their time. Kinda might depend on A, how good a shape you are in, and B, how much running you really did. If you didn't do a lot of running or a lot of exercise, then you probably don't take much time off your holding a breath. Oh well. But if you seriously exercise and run as fast as you can for 2 minutes, yeah, you might lose quite a bit of time there on being able to hold your breath. After 30 seconds of deep breathing, most people will gain, 15 to 25 seconds. Partially that's because you've got normal levels of carbon dioxide. It takes the 45 seconds to a minute to get up to the point where you have to take a breath. But deep breathing will decrease the amount of carbon dioxide further than usual. That usually buys you another 15 to 25 seconds to get to normal, and then you've still got your 45 seconds to a minute to hold your breath that you normally could. So which one lets you hold your breath the longest? The deep breathing. On page 94, number 3, letter D. I'm still not sure why it doesn't get its own little category there, but letter D says a simple test for carbon dioxide is to blow air through lime water. If a white material collects at the bottom of the beaker, or all throughout the test tube, carbon dioxide is present. On the picture here, we do have, on the left, we've got a test tube that is without carbon dioxide, but does have some lime water in it. Before you start blowing bubbles in the test tube, the lime water is actually clear. The middle test tube has been blown air in the straw for probably about 5 minutes, and you can actually see a color change, although it hasn't done as much as it could. If you'll blow bubbles for 20 minutes, the test tube on the right-hand side, that would be one that has a lot of carbon dioxide in it. The lab book asks, what's the source of the carbon dioxide? The exhaled air, perhaps? Yep, that's the one, exhaled air. Does this confirm the presence of carbon dioxide in exhaled air? Sure. Why not? On the other hand, was anybody really doubting that you breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide? I mean, really, we've known that since 3rd grade. Most people really weren't doubting the fact that you breathe out the carbon dioxide. And let's face it, we're non-science majors, so how many people actually knew that carbon dioxide reacted with lime water to form a milky white precipitate to begin with? I mean, it could be any chemicals in there. There's no Oh, sorry. In chemistry class, carbon dioxide and lime water do react to form a milky white precipitant that would prove things to chemistry majors, not necessarily non-science majors. But we'll go with it anyway. On page 94, at the bottom, number 4, respiratory gas transport and exchange. The lab book does say that most of the oxygen in the body is carried as a compound called oxyhemoglobin. However, they'll never mention the oxy part again, and we'll just call it hemoglobin. Each red blood cell does contain about 250 million molecules of hemoglobin. Each hemoglobin can ultimately carry 4 oxygens. So theoretically, each red blood cell can carry how many oxygen molecules? 4 per hemoglobin times 250 million. Each red blood cell can carry about 1 billion molecules of oxygen. That's a good thing. We do need quite a bit of oxygen for our body. Now, most of the carbon dioxide is just diffused in the bloodstream, although there's a technicality, science major stuff. Most of the carbon dioxide is carried as a bicarbonate ion, which is produced when carbon dioxide combines with water in the blood, but still, carbon dioxide diffuses around the body, even if it does get converted to something else and then has to be converted back to carbon dioxide. On page 95, the lab book continues with a little experiment on a gas chromatograph. They're basically measuring the amount of oxygen and carbon dioxide in various locations. We're supposed to use the information on the chart and circle the correct answer. For number 1, there is more oxygen or carbon dioxide in inhaled air. Inhaled air on the oxygen side is 210. Amount present in exhaled air is... carbon dioxide would be 3. Yeah, screwed that one up. There's more oxygen in inhaled air. Carbon dioxide would be 0.3. Oxygen would be 210. Number 2, the lungs do or do not absorb all of the oxygen present in the inhaled air. Look at the oxygen in the inhaled air of 210 and the amount present in the exhaled air of 180. That's a difference of only 30. Really, the lungs do not remove anywhere near close to all of the oxygen. They don't absorb even most of it. That's probably best because you're going to exhale the air right in front of your nose, and if you absorbed all of the oxygen, and then you exhale the air, and then your next breath there was nothing to breathe, that might be bad. So it's probably a good thing that the lungs do not absorb all of the oxygen. The oxygen content of artery or vein blood is greater. Artery 195, vein 150. Artery would certainly be higher. The oxygen content of most standard arteries, aside from that pulmonary artery, should be greater. Number 4, the lungs do or do not remove all of the carbon dioxide from the blood. Note the amount present of carbon dioxide in the venous blood would be 520, and the amount of carbon dioxide in the artery blood is 480. Well, it's still a difference of 40, which I guess is bigger than the amount of oxygen you were absorbing, but truthfully, you don't remove all of the carbon dioxide from the blood either. That's a little weird too. Number 5, the body consumes oxygen and produces carbon dioxide. You've probably known that since about the 5th grade when you figured out that we breathe in oxygen so we can consume it, and we produce carbon dioxide so that we exhale it. Yeah, that's nice. Number 6, most of the oxygen is carried by blood plasma or red blood cells. Now, the lab book did a bad thing. They've got the carrying capacity of blood plasma at 0.3, and they've got the carrying capacity of whole blood, which has red blood cells in it. So go with the 195 and the red blood cells that are in the whole blood. We're going to omit number 7. I have faith that what they really meant to say was the lungs absorb oxygen and release carbon dioxide. And I don't deny that one. The lungs do take in oxygen from the atmosphere and do release carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. But remember, once the lungs absorb the oxygen from the atmosphere, they've got to release the oxygen to the bloodstream. That oxygen in the bloodstream goes around to the cells who pick it up, use it, make some carbon dioxide. The lungs would have to absorb the carbon dioxide from the bloodstream before they can release it to the atmosphere. I don't like the question. I'm sure they meant to say it absorbs oxygen from the atmosphere and releases to the atmosphere, but really you would release oxygen into the bloodstream and absorb the carbon dioxide from the bloodstream as well. Bad question, just omit number 7. And that's really all I've got for Exercise 9, the respiratory system. Exercise 10 is the digestive system, coming up next week.